Today we're going to break down a deck that aims to get the Capitoline Triad into play, and activated quick and easy. From the new Assassin's Creed mini set that's smaller, with less cards and packs, but it's more expensive, comes the Capitoline Triad, which I refer to as the Capital One Triad, or as the guys who push that one nerd Pepe onto the ground at school, or POV you are 5'11". It's a 10 generic mana legendary God Artificer that's 7/7. It does cost 1 less for each historic card in your graveyard, and you can exile any number of historic cards from your graveyard with a total mana value of 30 or greater. When you do, you get an emblem with creatures you control have a base power and toughness of 9/9. Normally the focus of my videos are the commanders, but in this case the Capitoline Triad are not the commander. They're a hidden commander, or more realistically they're a combo piece. When you get the combo to work, you get the Capitoline Triad into play and get the emblem in one fell swoop. So instead we'll be using Akul the Unrepentant as the commander. It's a 2 black, 2 red mana Scorpion Dragon Rogue, which may be the coolest type line in a while. It's a 5/5 with flying and trample. You can sacrifice 3 other creatures to put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. Activate this ability only as a sorcery and only once a turn. We'll be using Akul's Snek Attack ability to get the Capitoline Triad into play and activated by putting high mana value historic cards into the graveyard through spells. The entire deck list will be linked in the description below, and after each section in the video I'll be providing alternatives, which will also be in the link under the Considering section. In addition to using Akul's ability to cheat out the Triad, we can also run the classic Snek Attack. Since our plan is to get the Triad into play and activated on the same turn, the Snek Attack drawback of having to bend the creature you cheat out doesn't really matter too much. Thran Temporal Gateway is kind of a long-term sneak attack since you don't need to sacrifice the creature you sneak out. I think this is probably not the right call since you don't want to do this over and over again. You want to get the Capitoline Triad out once and that's it. Through the Breach is only barely worse than Sneak Attack since the 5 mana investment is the same if you do Sneak Attack and activate it in the same turn. The biggest drawback is that you can't split the cost across 2 turns, where Sneak Attack can be cast on 4 and then activated on 5 for just 1 mana. I think you really just choose whichever one you want and go with that, or the one you already have in your collection. We've got the Triad out, and now we need to be able to activate it, so we run a package of cards that will put cards into the graveyard, and I lump in the burial targets in the section since it's all the same goal. The targets are Draco, Scion of Draco, and Metalwork Colossus. Getting Draco and one of the others really puts you ahead as far as getting to that 30 mana value. The card Buried Alive will get all of them and is the best option hands down. The rest of the burial cards are single target burials like the classic Entomb, which is a simple 1 mana to get a single card into your graveyard. Goblin Engineer and Unmarked Grave will get certain types of cards into the graveyard, either artifacts or non-legendary lands. Note that Draco, Scion of Draco, and Metalwork Colossus are not legends and are artifacts. Goblin Engineer won't really activate much. Obviously a situation may come up where that does behoove you to do so, but in general this is just something to get something else in the bin. Lively Dirge is fine. It essentially boils down to a 3 mana sorcery speed Entomb, which is nowhere near as good as Entomb is, but it's fine for our purposes. I don't see the other ability being used here all that much. Vile Entomber is an Entomb on a stick, which is somewhat relevant since you can then sacrifice the body to Akul to help get the Capitoline Triad into play. The only alternate that I think you really should consider is the Cauldron of Eternity. This is a 12 mana value historic target that most of your burial cards can put into the graveyard. However, it doesn't get put there by all of them, and it doesn't do really that much while it's in play, but it is 1 more mana value than Metalwork Colossus, which could be the difference in activating the Triad or not. These cards are all cards that will do double duty as creatures to sacrifice to Akul, and historic cards with high mana values. And there are 2 types of cards that will fit into this category, and we'll start with Affinity. In our case, Affinity for artifacts. Cards like Mere Enforcer and Sojourner's Companion, which I expect to be about 3 mana to cast, but it'll count as 7 mana in the graveyard. Sojourner's Companion has the added bonus of being able to put itself directly into the graveyard through artifact land and cycling. Mycosynth Golem could be considered a burial target at 11 mana value, but I think it is entirely possible to get this out normally given the number of small artifacts that we do run. But do feel free to target this with an Entomb effect to get more mana value into the graveyard if you need it. Imskir Iron Eater and Chisgoria Forge Tyrant are both historic cards with affinity for artifacts. They both have high mana value and are sacrificable to Akul. Both have pretty good abilities just for being cast, with Imskir letting you draw some cards and Chisgoria basically getting you a free artifact considering it has haste and you can attack with it right when you cast it. The next card type that works really well here is Prototype, which I had originally wanted to use in my M-Scare deck, but it didn't actually work due to Prototype rules of overriding mana value while in play. But it does not overwrite mana value while in the graveyard, which makes Prototype ideal for this Akul Triad combo. Cheap historic creatures to cast. After their sacrifice, they become high mana value historic cards. Frogmere Enforcer and Goring Warplow are super cheap to get into play, but will be a 6 or 7 mana value while in the graveyard. Phyrexian Fleshgorger, Blitz Automaton, and Phalagi Dragon Engine are all 3 mana to get into play on the cheap, and will be worth 7 or 8 mana value in the graveyard. Most of the creatures don't actually matter while they're in play. They are there purely to be artifacts to help cast affinity cards or to be sacrificed to Akul. The one exception may be Skitterbeam Battalion, which will make 2 additional copies of itself. This is handy since the card by itself can activate Akul, and provide a 3 discount for artifact affinity cards. And once the Triad gets activated, this will actually make 3 9/9s with Trample and Haste. There aren't too many alternates since Prototypes is a classic one and done set design only in the Brothers' War. But for affinity cards, I think Furnace Hellkite could be a fine replacement. It's historic, it's an artifact and a creature, so it works with all your key combo setups. Refurbished Familiar is probably the only other card I might consider since it is cheap to get out and historic, but 4 is really low in mana value terms compared to your other historic cards. We'll start the ramp with Leaden Mirror and Iron Mirror. Ramp, artifact creatures, these work on about every trajectory your deck wants. We then run some classic mana ramp in Rakdos Signet, Talisman of Indulgence, and Mindstone. Follow that up with Felwar Stone, Thought Vessel, and a new choice I've been meaning to try out, Solar Transformer. Yes, it comes into play tapped, and yes, after 3 uses for colored mana, it becomes worse than a diamond. But I don't think you really need more than 3 uses, and since I don't use Arcane Signet, having a 2-mana rock that can get any color of mana is worth trying out. I finish up the ramp with Dark Ritual, Songs of the Damned, and the old school mana dork, Priest of Yawgmoth, which can get you a buttload of mana if you happen to sacrifice an affinity card with a mana value of 7, but it only costs you 3 to get out. You could probably remove the Dark Ritual, Songs of the Damned, and Priest of Yawgmoth, and add more artifact mana creatures like Ornithopter of Paradise or Hedron Crawler, just to boost up the artifact count for affinity. You could also power up and go with something like Lotus Petal, Mana Crypt, and Mana Vault. Either way, I think replacing the non-artifact ramp with artifact ramped might be the way to go, despite my nostalgia for Dark Ritual and whatnot. Since we're going to be sacrificing stuff to eventually make all our creatures 9/9, it behooves us to have creatures that can be sacrificed and come back later, when they are ready to be crazy huge instead of teeny tiny. Bloodghast and Nether Trader are both classic, I don't know what you call them, come back on their owners, self-reanimators, whatever they are, they're good. Then we run a bunch of skeleton type stuff in Persistent Specimen, Reassembling Skeleton, and Razor Lash Transmogrant. These are all cheap to get into play and sacrifice, but they can come back later when they'll be 9/9s. The only alternate that I might think about here is Retrofitted Transmogrant, which is it's nice to sacrifice being only 1 mana, but it does cost 4 to come back, which is, I think it's a bit much, though if you want more Eternal type cards, I think this is fine to run. To leverage our sacrifice potential and our 9/9 potential, we're going to run a few token generating cards. This won't be like a classic token deck since Rakdos ain't about anthems and stuff like that. I'm going to start with Glimpse the Impossible, which maybe doesn't super fit well in this section, or any section really, but that's because it works so well in the deck. It kind of does everything. For 3 mana, you get card draw, you get ramp, you get more creatures to sacrifice, or 3 9/9s if you play it after your Triad emblem is online. It's just outstanding stuff. Bitter Blossom will make you tokens forever and ever until you die. It's probably the most reliable token generator in black, though it does take a full round to create its first token. Lord Skitter, Sewer King, and Loyal Apprentice both don't have to wait the full round and can get the extra body the turn they come into play. We finished the token section with 2 token fireballs in Song of Totentons and Tempt with Vengeance. Both will make X 1/1 creatures with haste, which will become X 9/9s after you have got your emblem into play. These are great ways to close out a game. For a while, Legomos Hand of Hatred and Jadargul Caller of Nephalia were both in the main deck, but after testing I prefer token creators that would make more permanent tokens. Both of them can really only have one token out at a time, whereas the token creators in the main deck can stack them up to get several out at one time. That way you can save some up, sacrifice some, and then attack with the others after you get your emblem going. I had considered Krenko Mob Boss for a while, but I only run the one Goblin Engineer to power it up, and while it would eventually create lots and lots of tokens if unimpeded, I felt like that would just take too long, and with 9/9s you should have the game wrapped up fairly quick. I run a small interaction package consisting of Chaos Warp, Wild Magic Surge, and Deflecting Swat. We don't have a lot of room for control elements, so we have to make these as generic as possible, targeting as many things as possible as well. These three will work on the widest range of targets. Deflecting Swat I feel is probably best suited to deflect targeted graveyard removal until you've already activated the Triad and gotten your emblem going. Rakdos has a lot of great targeted removal, so feel free to use what you like. I don't think any one piece of interaction here will make or break the deck. Run what you think is good for your meta or what you think is fun. Like the prototypes, the sculpting is broken down into two subtypes. The first group I'll just call Thrills, since they are all plays on Thrill of Possibility. They generally discard or sacrifice something and then you draw 2 cards. It's important to have some type of discard because if you draw Draco and Scion of Draco, it becomes real hard to get the 30 mana value required for the Triad activation. These sculpting cards with discard will help ease some of that pain. Seize the Spoils, Demand Answers, and Cathartic Reunion will all help get your big boys into the bin and get you some extra cards in your grip. Eviscerator's Insight, Deadly Dispute, and Costly Plunder will let you sacrifice an artifact or creature. Ideally, you'd want to sacrifice a token, but in a pinch you can sacrifice a Felwar Stone that isn't being used or whatever you got. The second half of the sculpting is tutors. I generally don't like running this many, if any at all, but considering this is a hidden commander / combo type deck, we really need to be able to get the Capitoline Triad into our hand and cards that will put our giant historic cards into the graveyard. Demonic Tutor and Grim Tutor are just the de facto tutors. Just go and get a card and put it into your hand. Gamble is for the truly brave if you decide to get the Triad with it, because you don't really have a great way to get the Triad back if you do end up discarding it. You can use it to get stuff like Draco and then discard it with one of your other sculpting spells that have discard, so you do have some options with Gamble. Diabolic Intent is basically Demonic Tutor, but you have to sacrifice a creature. I would recommend sacrificing a token creature. Profane Tutor is a delayed Demonic Tutor, and I think you can actually use that just fine. You should be able to see a few turns ahead by what you currently have in play or in your hand, so you know what you're tutoring for, what you're trying to discard, etc, etc. So getting a free mana value tutor the turn you plan on playing the combo is pretty nice. I really like Wish Claw Talisman in the deck. Firstly, it's historic, so it will help directly with the Triad. Secondly, you can get it with Goblin Engineer and get it back with Goblin Engineer. And thirdly, you can sacrifice it with something like Costly Plunder while its ability is on the stack. So you get the tutor, but your opponents don't get control of it. The last tutors are Vampiric Tutor and Insatiable Avarice, which will both put any card on top of your deck. Insatiable Avarice is actually pretty good at catching you up if you've got a hand without a lot of sculpting or tutoring, and you're just kind of floundering drawing one card a turn. I had Tarian's Journal in this deck for a bit, before deciding that it was very good when you had tokens going, but not very good when you didn't. You could also run Imperial Seal to drop the average mana value down, but increase the average real-world price per card up. I only run a few wipes for similar reasons as to why I don't run a ton of interaction. Damnation, because it's 4 mana destroy all creatures. That's something you can depend on. I then run Mutilate and Toxic Deluge. The hope here is that when your creatures become 9/9s, you are bigger than the rest of the table, and can use these wipes with negative toughness to keep your creatures alive and unimpeded by other creatures on the battlefield. For some versatility, you could run Final Act, or if you're in something like a artifact-heavy meta, you could run Anzrag's Rampage. Rakdos has a ton of great wipes, so feel free to mess around with these 2 slots. I start utility lands with my favorite card ever, Dust Bowl. This is to kill problematic non-basic lands, like Dust Bowl. I then run 3 more lands that will just make tokens in Field of the Dead, Carekeep, and Merrick's. Good to make creatures to sacrifice, and then good to make creatures that are 9/9s. Dwarven Mine is probably okay, but this instance of the deck is kind of light in red mana requirements, so we don't have a ton of mountains. In another version of this deck with more red mana requirements, I could see this being really good. Rakdos also has tons of options for utility lands like Bojuka Bog. Feel free to run what you think is best for your style and meta. I run 3 artifact lands in Vault of Whispers, Great Furnace, and Darkseal Citadel. These will help with affinity and can be searched for with Goblin Engineer and Sojourner's Companion. I also run an Ancient Tomb because I have one. This seems like the best spot to put it in, and there isn't too much downside to it. If you don't have one, you can just run another basic land, with the words Ancient Tomb written on it. I run 12 lands that'll produce Rakdos, run the best that you got or the best that you want to proxy. I finish off the deck with 9 swamps and 5 mountains. The optimal situation would be getting Buried Alive, the Triad, and Glimpse the Impossible in your opening hand, so you would have everything you need to get Akul out and activated in one turn on like turn 5. But honestly, if you need to tutor and draw some cards, you can still get your combo pretty quick and get it all in one turn. Once assembled, every creature you have will have a 9/9 base. All your tokens, all your prototypes, all your skeletons. I think this deck is really powerful, but there are also a few glaring weaknesses like a Rest in Peace or a Leyline of the Void that will make it hard to accumulate your 30 mana value worth of historic cards in the graveyard. But honestly, this deck is kind of resilient. Even if your Akul gets like Pithing Needled, you can usually just discard enough cards to at least get the Triad out with the reduced historic cost. And once you get the emblem, you should be in for smooth sailings. And as this deck shows, it is pretty easy to get the Capitoline Triad out and activated in the same turn. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to watch another video like this one, which YouTube will recommend because the YouTube algorithm knows what you want like deep down in your heart. Subscribe if you want more videos like this, check out my Patreon to support the channel, and I will see you around.